Ananya to start the OGF.
All right. Hey guys, and welcome to the Open Grand Finals of the Shri Ram Debating Festival.
Recording in progress.
Just a sec. All right. Now, now that everyone has consented to the streaming and observers, now we'll move on to introductions. First, I'll introduce myself.
In
Hey
progress.
guys, I'm Ananya. I'm going to be the chair for this round. My preferred pronouns are he and him. Let's have a great debate. Now I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Akshay Chikanesha, preferred pronouns are he, him, although I prefer if you refer to the panel as a whole. Looking forward for an enriching and engaging debate. All the best to both teams.
Hi guys, Amisha here. I'll be the panelist for this round. Have a great debate. Preferred pronouns she and her.
Hi everyone, my name is Banun. I have no preference. Good luck to both teams.
Hi, hi guys, Ahmad here, panelist for the round, he, him pronouns.
Hi, my name is Jihan. I'll be your panel today. No preference on gender pronunciations. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Kumar Arjun, and I'll also be the panelist. Prefer pronouns he, him. Best of luck, both the teams. Thank you.
All right, assuming that the panel has introduced themselves, I would ask the government to introduce themselves first.
Pratik is going second, Shakya is going. Pratik is going first, Shakya is going second, Devashish is going third. We'll let you know who's going to reply. No gender preference. All the best.
All right, and then I would like ask the opposition to introduce themselves as well.
Shruti going first, Nitin going second, Abhirup going third, Nitin going reply, or Shruti going reply, we'll tell you at the end.
All right, so with that, since the government has vetoed motion 1 and the op has vetoed motion 2, we are going to debate on the motion 2. That is, this how it would replace real world prison incarnation with simulated incarnation for people not sentenced to a life sentence. With that, I would ask the Prime Minister to open the case from side prop. Here.
I hope I'm audible. It's all good. I assume I am.
Muffled.
Okay, I hope this is better.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, POIs in the chat, please. Don't unmute. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, let's go. Before jumping into the substantive argumentation, first, one clarification. This debate is not about whether this will happen or not. This will happen. We have caveat to a large extent. So like buy-in arguments, etc. are irrelevant. But even if they are going to go ahead and make this is necessarily is likely to receive support from both sides of the aisle, to the extent that most individuals who are pro-incarceration are likely to support this, or at least a large number of, because it maintains a deterrent effect, because criminals still face incarceration on a mental level. But secondly, liberals are also likely to support it, and thus fence it is also likely to support it. So like no buy-in, buy-out. So buy-in is still likely to happen. So this policy will happen. Motion assumes it. But even then, even if they're going to argue against it, buy-in is still likely to happen anyway. With that, 6 positive arguments in our case. First, this is the best reformation possible and fulfill the goal of the criminal justice system first. The goal of the criminal justice system is necessarily to reform individuals who have committed a crime, i.e. they believe that individuals who have committed a crime must serve their time and accordingly be reintegrated, be allowed to reintegrate into society. However, due to a myriad of problems, that doesn't happen in status quo, and predominantly that is due to prison conditions which are extremely poor. Necessarily, the simulation provides, firstly, an ideal prison environment wherein there is no gang violence, no scope for police brutality within the prisons, and no violence amongst prisoners themselves. That is to say, the possibility and scope for reformation is at its highest. We can possibly simulate therapy. We can have therapy post this simulated incarceration as well to that extent. But secondly, we simulate the incarceration and also still maintain the deterrent effect as well as the full impact of the incarceration in the first place. That is to say, you still feel time passing by. You still feel the fact that you have been, like, you feel 10 years pass by over a long period of time. And necessarily the fact that if you are in a cell or within a prison complex, even if it is a simulated one, the fact of the matter is that you'll still feel that you have been incarcerated, and you feel this impact of this incarceration on yourself to a large degree. So to a likely effect, it is still likely to continue to like punish criminals who have committed crimes or violated social contract, but be like, we can say it's akin to like feeling DMT for a few years, etc. Right? Moreover, I think an important clarification is this is about crimes for which reformation is possible, because it's not about people who are sentenced to life sentences in the first place. I.e., if you are a serial killer, somebody who's trigger warning, committed grievous sexual offenses or committed terrorism and things like that, the bar for which is extremely high, you are likely to get a life sentence or incur the capital punishment. Moreover, we also think the bar for such punishments, either for life imprisonment or capital punishment, is extremely high. There's also a global trend towards making sure that all criminals who are imprisoned for life or who are receive the capital punishment do so only for the most serious of the serious crimes. It's said by the Indian Supreme Court as well. So we don't necessarily, it's about these very specific group of crimes wherein there is a retributive punishment that is exacted, and we don't and society and due process and the courts of law don't believe reformation is necessarily possible. So what is this debate about, and what sort of crimes are this debate about? These are crimes that are viewed as reformable, wherein an individual is sentenced to like a few years in jail, like stuff like robbery, thief, low-level drug offenses, and things like that, wherein the court system believes that this person, having spent a few years in jail, can necessarily reform themselves and go back into society. Why then are there manifold benefits to this? Firstly, reformation actually happens on a meaningful level in that prisoners can reintegrate into society and don't lose years of their life. Due to mandatory minimums and weird, horrible laws which necessarily sentence people to 10 years in jail for literally a single joint, necessarily they're chucked into prison for 10 to 15 years. Not only do they lose years of employment, and this rampantly impacts individuals from the lower socioeconomic strata of society, wherein if they lose years of the employment, not only do they greatly suffer, but they also their family as a whole suffers to a great extent. Not only do they lose money, they lose the ability to find a job. I mean, sure, prison itself makes you damage the ability to find a job, but I think it's considerably less on our side because you don't have that much of a gap in employment. Furthermore, children in the cases where both parents are convicted are sent away to child protective services and things like that. That necessarily doesn't happen on our side to the same extent as it continues to occur in status quo. Secondly, one of the major problems in plaguing prisons around the world is the fact that police brutality and torture within prisons is extremely real, because there are very limited checks and balances, in large parts of the world, wherein this happens within these particular systems to that extent. So we think that on a priori, it's good for human rights and the fact that the dignity and respect for these prisoners is maintained. Thirdly, and very importantly, gang culture in prisons is particularly pernicious in status quo. That is to say, in real physical prisons where people have to join gangs for safety in order to ensure that they are not killed due to gang violence within prisons, they either are on two levels necessarily have problems necessarily accrue. Not only are they exposed to large amounts of internal prison violence, which not only hardens them into more hardened criminals, but also the fact that it vilifies people who have actually left prison, because a lot of people have the view that once they have left prison, they actually joined a gang in prison, and the view of people who have come out of prison is necessarily bad. To the extent that this reduces the vilification of criminals on like re-entry into society, we think this is a benefit that necessarily stands. Fourthly, we think this system is cheap to maintain in that the amount of money that you spend on the maintenance of a physical prison and like all infrastructure that necessarily goes around with it is significantly less. We think when we posit that you can necessarily spend this money in better places, such as the reintegration of these prisons, spend it reintegration of prisoners back into society, spend it on therapy, spend it on like helping prisoners find job post incarceration and things like that. Before moving on, yeah, sure, Nitin, go ahead, Pierre.
Why not just fine people if retribution is so easy?
Fine. Oh, No, what? I don't understand the question. What yes, the prisons is like the criminal justice system does fine people for extremely petty like stuff like traffic violence violation. This is about like relatively moderate crimes which get prison sentences. Unsure where this comes from. Anyway, cool. False imprisonment, right? The worst iteration of the criminal justice system, which exists on either side, and it's immensely regrettable, is false imprisonment, which directly and disproportionately impacts members of minority communities. This happens in status quo and is likely to happen on either side. However, the extremely bad impacts are mitigated to a certain extent on our side, wherein you don't lose years of your life. Sure, you do to a certain extent feel that mental trauma of being incarcerated for years, but that's comparatively better than on their side, wherein you feel the mental trauma and also are subject to the horrible conditions of prison, but also lose years of life. Necessarily also then reforming problems with these prisons significantly better, because not only you have to, it's easier to reform a computer simulation, but also you have a larger amount of data set points as opposed to in their world. Lastly, in terms of backlash, I think I've already preemptively dealt this in this clarification, but like we're likely to face support from a large amount of liberals as well as individuals who are pro-incarceration, because you're still facing incarceration to a certain extent. You're likely to have buy-in from either side. So, and anyway, OP has to do two things. They will either say that no change must happen, which like on which all the harms of the prison system stand, or the second thing is they'll pose a radical change which requires significantly more political capital. On both of these things, propose.
All right, I would like to thank the PM for their fine speech, calling upon the leader of opposition to open the case from side op. Here.
Confirming that I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. My internet has been sort of choppy, so if at any point I cut out, please ask Nitin to give me a call or something. Okay. POIs in the chat, if I haven't taken one by 5:30, which is unlikely, please unmute, interrupt, and make sure that I take one. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I wish I lived in the fucking La La Land that proposition lives in, where sexual assault goes ahead and gives you a life sentence. Individuals that commit sexual assault go on to become politicians. They go on to become Supreme Court chief justices. They don't even fucking get cancelled on Twitter, really, unsure as to what this world is that they live in, right? Note that individuals that commit assault, domestic violence, cause dowry deaths, go ahead and commit things as grievous as rape. Even these individuals don't actually get convicted with life sentences in most countries across the world. Additionally, there has also been a global trend to shift towards shorter sentences by virtue of all of the campaigning that activists for prison rights have been doing over the years. The second piece of rebuttal is in terms of wrongful incarceration and mandatory minimums. Note that these are incredibly tragic things that exist on both sides of the house. However, at no point does government prove why this is the exclusive and only way of going ahead and correcting mandatory minimums as well as wrongful incarcerations. If they say that this prison system is going to be, this virtual system is going to be as effective in terms of creating reformation amongst individuals, they mean that this prison simulation is going to be a little terrible in many ways, which means that these individuals that are wrongfully incarcerated still go on to suffer in some ways on their side of the house, which we think should be eliminated altogether on either sides, right? But note that they never tell you why exclusively this simulation is the only way of doing away with this kind of discrimination that minorities face. Therefore, they cannot really go ahead and claim all of the impacts of it, right? Third and finally, they tell you that, oh, look, it's going to be so much easier for you to reintegrate into society because you lose less time. I'm not sure why that's necessarily a good thing. I'm not sure why that's a good thing at all, given that we don't think that majority of all convictions are in fact wrongful. We think the majority of them are right. However, yes, discriminatory tendencies do in fact reflect in CJS, which we have alternative ways of fixing on our side of the house. What then is our constructive case? First piece of characterization, what is the purpose of prisons? We think it is to go ahead and ensure that there is deterrence, retribution, and reformation. Secondly, what is our counterfactual? Obviously understand that there is an incredible amount of fiat that government has in this debate, right? We think on our side of the house, therefore symmetrically, we should also be able to go ahead and reform prison systems as well as the CJS, right? We think this largely looks like increasing oversight and accountability in terms of who your prison wardens are, introducing rigorous methods of rehabilitation programs within prison systems, and also going ahead and aiding reintegration once the entire prison sentence has been served. Three arguments we present to you then. Firstly, on deterrence, 3 layers of analysis here. Firstly, a framing as to why this is important. This is our first argument because every other method of dealing with a crime is retrospective. The best way to deal with a crime is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Fear of prison sentences is exactly what does that in the status quo. Why does this fear exist? 2 layers of analysis. One, people value time. As a resource, it's the only one that's definitively finite, no matter who you are and where you come from. Time is the ability to achieve your goals, make love to your partner, eat your favorite food, enjoy your favorite experiences. Time is the fundamental prerequisite to doing all the things that make life worth living, which is why losing time is something that people are genuinely terrified of. Secondly, time as a comparative. Something that additionally goes ahead and entrenches this fear is the fact that you as an individual that is getting incarcerated is going to lose time while everyone else around you is not. So when you come out of prison, your children are grown, don't recognize you. Parents are potentially dead, friends are married and have moved on. You as an individual are left behind, and we think this is one of the fundamental reasons why people are terrified of committing crimes, because they know nobody is going to stop around and wait for them. It is their life that gets wasted away, right? This deterrence goes away entirely on their side of the house, because you're only in prison for what, an entire day, maybe a week, and we don't think this has the kind of impact that they promise that it will in terms of deterrence. Secondly, on the idea of retribution, victims already go ahead and face a double jeopardy on their side of the house. Not only do they have to be subjected to a heinous crime that changed their life forever, they also only after a couple of days realize that their culprit is one that is out in society again. We think this is an incredibly humiliating experience for these victims, in that they feel that their feelings have been invalidated given that this culprit is now out and free and their life is now going back to normal and they're reintegrating incredibly well, as proposition promises you these individuals will. Note that the triple jeopardy that they introduce on their side of the house is that you see these potential criminals around you, right? The kind of feeling of safety that you always had within your safe spaces, around your home, around your neighborhood, perhaps in your social circles, particularly for victims of assault, of sexual assault from people who were near and dear to them, this becomes incredibly ravaging, particularly to their mental health. Note that PTSD is something that a lot of these victims have to suffer from anyway, except it's not post-traumatic anymore, it's literally present traumatic. You're seeing these individuals around you every single day. We think the detriment that this causes to the mental health of a victim is insurmountable and cannot be excused on their There was a POI in the chat. What?
Oh, right.
I'm sorry, can the timer please be stopped? I'll take 15 seconds extra at the end. Yeah. Shakya, are you good to go now? Can you do hello, Mike?
Yeah, I'm saying, if you're so against the idea of not taking away time from these prisoners, are you also against ideas such as parole and probation?
No, I don't think parole and probation is the same. You only get parole when you're in prison for a given amount of time, reflect definitive change in your behavior, show that you're willing to improve and become a better person. It is only on those conditions that parole is handed out to you, and during probation, there is incredible amount of oversight on you. You can't go around, roam around freely in society, you have an ankle monitor, you can only go X number of kilometers away from your house, not near a gun shop, not near the not near the alleged victim, and things like that, right? Parole and probation are not comparative here. Final argument then on reformation and why that's more likely on our side of the house. And this argument is crucial. Yes, some reformation happens as a result of reflection and inward looking. However, a lot of reformation happens because you simply cannot go outside and commit crimes again because time has passed. What do we mean by this? First layer of analysis. The broken windows theory states that often criminals are a result of the environment and the culture that they're raised in, right? For instance, this is a study that was done within the Bronx and projects because the rate of crime, particularly amongst youngsters, was incredibly high there. This was a result of the fact that they lived around homes where crime was the culture, where gangs were literally around every single nook and corner of their particular area, right? We think when you spend a significant amount of time in prisons, for example, if you spend 10 years, maybe 15 years and you come out, your circumstances have significantly changed, right? One, not only have you grown older, which essentially means that you're less likely to give in and less likely to get coerced into such situations, but also a lot of these gangs have simply broken up. These individuals have been arrested, are not proximate to you anymore, and things like that. Second layer of analysis, you're simply not able-bodied enough to carry forward crimes, right? Particularly if you go into prison sometime in your middle age, I think it's very unlikely that you're coming out at the age of 60 or 70 and going around committing crimes, right? We just don't think your body is logistically going to support you in such instances. And third and finally, in several instances, the crime itself has changed. Note that this particularly applies to white-collar criminals who come from backgrounds of privilege. Harshad Mehta being a great example of this. If Harshad Mehta were to be released out into regular society again the next day, what was to stop him to again go ahead and fuck around with the stock market, right? We think the fact that you're still apprised of the technology, the fact that you still know how to go ahead and continue and perpetuate those same crimes again and again is something that exclusively changes when time itself changes. Final layer of analysis on this is that these individuals now simply just have more time to rebuild their reputation, rebuild their lives, go back to living a life of normalcy. We don't think that's a good thing on either sides of the house. Incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, that was a fine speech from the leader of opposition, calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister to extend the case from side prop. Here, here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. Okay. Just setting up my timer. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Shruti burden pushes and says, tell us why this is exclusively the only way to deal with the issues. For you, at which point opposition have lost. The prison industrial complex. I will elaborate on this a bit more, but notice that the harsh reality which we live in and the grotesque world that we are a part of doesn't really mean that prisoners actually get to reform themselves or even have the benefit of reformation when they necessarily go to the prison. OP wants you to forget that racism exists within the criminal justice system, and they also want you to forget that prisoner rights is something that's still legitimately applicable. They also want you to forget that within these prisoners are also people who are political actors and people who are actually like a byproduct of literal racism, such as like the African American community within like USA, but more prominently these days the Muslim community within India. If all of this has been ignored in OP speech, I think they need to do way better at DLO. But a few responses to them targeted at their arguments. One. They say that we should be able to symmetrically reform prison systems. Therefore, like rehabilitation and all can happen. Why is this the only way? Look, I'll say one thing to this. If this is necessarily something that can happen, why hasn't it happened till now? And if it's something that hasn't happened, I'm willing to concede that there might be a prospective future where we all have prisons like that in Scandinavia, except our process is going to be faster through mechanization. I'll provide in just a minute. Two, they say losing time is what people are generally scared of. Therefore, we should stop doing this. One, I think my POI literally flustered their case, right? This is why you give paroles, because the idea of prison isn't necessarily that you need to lose time in order to repent for your crimes. If you're able to reform yourself and make up for the kind of shit that you've done, if you're able to reintegrate to a great extent, we think you're like the job that prisons are meant for is served in any way. I think it's the social isolation that leads to reformation, not the time that is taken away. I think then at this point, Elo says, show us how you will be a better person. If we can show this to you once again, we'll win. Also, secondly, they say examples like Harshad Mehta or whatever coming out and ruining the stock market again. Harsh Mehta was literally banned from the stock market. The simple fact that you're getting this punishment doesn't mean you don't get other punishment such as fines, financial penalties, being banned from places and stuff like that. Lastly, they say do things like put ankle monitors and stuff on them. Do it on our side too when they're out of it, if you really think there's some sort of criminality left within them. But we think the propensity of that is extremely low. Last argument they have is that it's bad for the victims. I'll say a few things about this because I do agree to some extent, maybe this might be so. But one, the possibility of this confrontation with the victim on their side is high too, because one, these people might get parole. But secondly, most importantly, most people who do shit like trigger warning again, sexual assault, literally don't go to prison. Louis C.K. literally got a Grammy yesterday. I don't know how this changes on their side either. But the problem is, are these people likely to repent? Will they reform to the extent that they will not be the sexist, weird monsters that they've ended up being? We don't think this happens on OP. Here's two reasons why it will on GOV. Number one, I want to talk about the prison industrial complex. We think physical incarceration is profitable. If we remove this aspect, we remove a lot of issues with the prison system. Why? One, it is profitable because government pays you directly and gives you subsidy or tax breaks. This is very prominent in America, where most prisons are privately run prisons, and often they have certain issues. They are more likely to trigger violence within prisons to instigate criminality so that they can extend prison systems and deny parole. This is because private prison systems profit more if the prison systems are longer. Notice, all of this harm that comes from the existence of pernicious incentives such as private prison systems or governmental prison systems that benefit from longer incarcerations and stuff goes away if you can remove the aspect of the physical presence of the prisoner within jail. since we remove this aspect on gov, we tackle a lot of issues. How so? One, if you remove them from like physical incarceration, you remove any incentive from private lobbies to ask for stricter prison sentences or prison sentences for meager crimes like drug possession. Why? Because if they're not there physically, they don't benefit from the government because they don't pay you. The reason you get paid for a private industrial complex, prison complex, is literally because of the kind of real estate that you own and the kind of services that you give. If you remove this physical presence aspect, sure, there will be probably private entities that are doing the simulation, but they won't have these prisons and they won't have the ability to exploit these prisoners to that extent. Then they say, how do we have better prison systems? And this leads to my second argument. But before that, I just want to point this out. The idea that we can remove this profit incentive from our world by removing the physical presence of prisoners is exactly why this is the exclusive and the best way to do this. Because they cannot say this. They cannot say we will do all of this because social justice movements or whatever they want to harp on DLO have failed till this point. We need to change within the prison system, and this is exclusively how we're going to go about and get this change. Two, then, why are our prison systems better, better on a comparative? One, the prison system is better, and this has to be better in what terms? I agree there is some aspects of retribution and stuff to deal with, but I'll say a few things about that, right? The aim of prison system is to reform primarily and not take revenge. And this is important because principally it is state failure that leads to criminality. It is the fact that the state didn't give you food that you stole. It is the fact that they didn't give you proper education because of which you probably did shit that was misguided. I'm sure there are instances that are probably not on the state, such as, once again, trigger warning, sexual assault. But in most instances, you have to agree it is the fault of the state. This is exactly why we need reformation. And this is exactly why prison is not purely about taking punishment. But once again, when you have rare and extreme cases, by the context slide in and of itself, we still have life imprisonment. So why is this better? Three reasons. One, there is likely going to be more of a focus on rehabilitation because you remove a lot of barriers to reformation, such as criminality, gang culture within prison, the stuff that Pratik talks to you about, but gets zero engagement from leader of opposition. Second, you don't ruin lives by taking away all those years. We think it's abhorrent that these lives are gone because once you have the social isolation, once you're removed from society, once you can't meet your family and the mental toll that takes on you, we think that is in and of itself good enough for reformation. The fact that happens when people realize they don't have a life after they get out of prison is exactly why they go towards criminality. People realize they won't be able to get a job when they get out of prison. So they try making criminal connections within these places. I think this is also particularly crucial about not ruining lives because a lot of times it's minorities that are directly affected due to wrongful incarceration, such as African Americans in USA. But third, and this is important, even if this is not necessarily true, and even if our prison system looks as bad as status quo, notice, one, we can change this better because it's cheaper and easier to reform this simulation. And two, because we have substantial data on how bad this is. Prison is removed from views. The political reality is that nobody really cares about prisoners, much like opposition. On our worst case, the few impacts we get is one, you have lower recidivism. Criminals are unlikely to commit crimes again, but also at least people don't lose out on their lives. Extremely proud to propose.
All right, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine speech. Now I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case from side off. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Starting. So sorry, starting my speech. In 3, 2, 1. I'll do three things in my speech. Firstly, tell you why the criminal justice system at all points in time should prioritize victims' retribution and not care about criminals. Then I'm going to tell you why we have better retribution and why that leads to better acceptance of criminals in society once they have served their sentence, therefore making them more employable. And lastly, I talked to you about why we have more deterrence. But just quickly on the idea of deterrence, right? If one side is arguing deterrence and the other side is arguing that it's a responsibility of the state to prevent crimes, we think we're pretty much on the same side. Before that, also on model, because they say that, look, there has been no progress in the world for prison reform and therefore it's not likely to happen in the future, right? One, this is largely a lie. Even in countries like America, which is probably their best example, private prisons are being banned and are being closed down. Nordic countries are abolishing prisons. There is large discourse about what kind of prisons are good for people and what kind of prisons do rehabilitation. But secondly, right, you can't say, oh, this world is not one where the prison systems are good, because your world is one where you have spent millions of dollars developing technology that we can't even imagine how to achieve today, which means presumably we can spend a few $100 at least providing therapy, at least making sure CCTV cameras in justice systems work, so on and so forth. This debate is about symmetricity, and that should be really important. Firstly, on prison systems and criminals, and why they can't just keep saying, oh, criminals are poor people, criminals are people who don't actually aren't bad people, so on and so forth. We think at all points in time, anyone who is a criminal is someone who has breached the social contract. Social contract is basically accepted compromises that we all make in society. Basically, the fact that I can't own a gun because if I owned a gun, someone else could also own a gun and they could also be safe. The problem with this is anyone who breaks it has real reasons to break it. If one person can own a gun in a society where guns are banned, that person has unbelievable negotiating power and can go ahead and do whatever they want, right? Anyone who can commit assault, robbery, benefits from it. You cannot claim that, look, this person is benefiting from breaking the social contract, therefore they aren't criminals. The fact that the point at which they choose to break the social contract, the point at which they consent to break the contract, we think they're individuals who believe they're better than everyone else. They think the rules don't apply to them and they therefore deserve to be punished, even if that punishment is disproportionate. Why is that true? Note that at a point at which you're consenting to do a crime, you understand what value that crime or holds in society and what punishment people deem valuable to it, right? For example, if you live in a society that stones people who are committing assault, you can't choose to commit assault and then say, oh, you're not okay with the trade you got. It's absolutely fair to do so. This is really important in this debate, because the comparative is victims not getting retribution, something they have not yet engaged with, and victims at no point in any capacity consent to crime. Why then do we think, also analytic, like in examples, why is it that most criminals are individuals who aren't who aren't committing crimes of means? One is because most countries have very good welfare schemes. There have been zero famines or zero people who are dying of starvations in any modern democracy. That's just categorically untrue, which means no one is stealing for bread. That's just not realistic, right? Even if you're stealing, it's probably doing drugs because you need the money. That's still something that's in a moral gray area, and I'll get to that later. The reason that also is not good enough is because judges make subjective decisions to punish you for X number of years. If you did a crime of means and you can prove to the judge that, look, I'm not a bad person, but I just had these circumstances, judges likely to take it into account and adjust your sentence accordingly, right? Thirdly, you're likely to go to jail, do community service, and do fines if the crime is small. The reason I'm bringing this very obvious shit up is because side government does not really have any response or analysis. They keep switching to convenient examples. So note, for all the convenient examples they give you, other methods of fixing them exist. Lastly, in terms of worst case, let's assume there is someone who's a victim of the state, who does not have food and the state failed that person completely. We think that's terrible for them. But the problem is on either side, they're equally fucked, right? In their world, that person goes to prison for 1 week, comes out into the same state where they still don't have a job, still don't have food, they steal again, go to that prison, still don't have a job, steal food. We think it's unfortunate that those people are being punished in the society. If they do exist, we still think that this debate is symmetric. Why then do we uniquely get retribution, and why do we need to engage that idea? Firstly, in terms of not engaging with the idea, right? We simply prove to you that people can only gauge retribution based on how they perceive that person to be punished. The fact that this person is free in 2 days, regardless of what they went through, is not something you're likely to be able to go understand, so on and so forth, which means that you need to see this person be punished. You want to live in a world where they don't come to work with you for 2 days. Why is this important? One, we think that when we punish individuals, we explain who we're siding with in the world, right? The fact that we punish sexual assault means that the state is telling individuals that, look, sexual assault at no point in time is okay. It creates precedent and it makes people more likely to report. That's the second point. We need people to report. People are only likely to report when they think that there is some sort of benefit to them. The fact that the perpetrator of the crime is not going to be present is what incentivizes people to come out and report. Why is reporting important? Just one, in terms of justice for the victim, but secondly, in terms of collecting data. We think the more victims that come out and speak up, we can collect data and have targeted policies. Targeted policies look like better education in certain regions, better corporate policies, so on and so forth. All of this requires victims to speak up, and all of this requires you giving victims an incentive to go ahead and speak up, and that happens through retribution, through punishing these criminals proportionate to their crime. Lastly, in terms of reformation, and this is really important, right? Because this is where Gov loses the debate. Gov's idea is that people come out of prison don't get jobs because people think they haven't been reformed. Therefore, recidivism is a function of perception of reform and not actual reformation. In their world, people will be like, 2 days ago you were murdering someone, now you're in my office asking for a job. I don't believe it, right? In our world, if you come out 15 years later, regardless of what is technically true, you're still going to be seen as someone who may have changed. You can talk about the experiences you had in 15 years, the people you met, the life you lived, and the things you've done in 15 years. And that is unique, which means you're more likely to get hired, you're more likely to be accepted by family members who are likely to provide you support, you're more likely to be helped by religious individuals who will provide you support, you're more likely to be generally accepted in communities and housing, so on and so forth. That is unique to our side, and that uniquely even prevents recidivism, which they care about. Lastly, on deterrence, and this is really important, right? We think what they have to engage with is time is a uniquely non-fungible asset that people have, right? Because everything else can be weighed against, which is to say, my ownership of a gun can be weighed against the fine I have to pay, or any criminal activity, or any punishment that I get. But time I lose cannot be weighed against anything. This uniquely deters people from doing crimes that should be already proved to you. What is an additional impact of this? One is the fact that it significantly incentivizes crime in their world. Why is that so? In their world, you're literally granting criminals more time than everyone else, right? Which is to say, we all die in 60, 70 years and time passes at a similar rate. But if I do a crime in the middle, I'm going to get an extra 10 years of my life without like having to live that much longer. I think they're actually incentivizing crime on their world. Secondly, this is something that is disproportionately going to benefit people who are privileged in white collar crimes. Why is that so? We think that it's very hard to catch white collar crimes before they happen, which means the only way we prevent white collar crimes is through civic deterrence for rich people. In their world, the fact that there is no deterrence for these people means that they can affect communities worse. They can make decisions that are like beyond what is legally allowed, so on and so forth. That is harmful for communities. Weigh this on their own impact of like protecting the most vulnerable, right? The fact that privileged people in their world can like do a crime, get extra 10 years of life, and then come back to living their privileged lives they had before means that the decisions they make affect minorities and poor people more than they affect other privileged people. It creates a cycle where these people now have to do crimes just to make up for the bad policies that have been passed, or redlining, like the banks doing redlining, so on and so forth. We think that's what you have to weigh against in this debate. Proud to oppose.
All right. I thank the DLO for their fine speech. Now calling upon the government whip to end the constructors from side prop. Here. Government whip, are you there? Could one of the members from government confirm that Devashish is here?
I'll just check.
Hi, confirming if I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Just give me 10 seconds. Okay, POIs in the chat. I'll take one at around 5 minutes, 30 seconds. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. OP had massive burdens to prove in this debate from the first speech itself, which they haven't. Let me just highlight those before I engage with their speeches. Number one,
how exactly they aim to reform the prison, especially when the state has to negotiate with actors like, for example, police administration and private prison complex, but also enforce those reforms on prison gangs, etc., who would be vehemently against it and thus making further police brutality on them inevitable. Number two, how do they enable prison to not resort to similar degree or higher degree of crimes when they are physically brutalized and forced to interact with the prison gangs in person? Number three, how would they give back the years to the prisoners so that they can resettle once they have reformed themselves, even in cases where prison system works in an ideal manner, something which they never actually characterized? Number four, how do they compensate people who suffered from false imprisonment and spent years and years in the prison system? If you observe your notes, there is no answer to these particular questions. All we have heard from side opposition till now is them poking holes in our case, something which I'm going to engage right now. First of all, they come up and argue that people who commit grave offenses are let off easily. But understand that it's rather symmetric in nature, considering the fact that they never claim how they bring reforms in the judiciary in their world. Whether you get life imprisonment for rape and all is dependent on which country you are in, by the way. India, as a matter of fact, there are stricter punishment. In France, there isn't. It's the same going to be the case in the op. They have to prove how exactly they improve that. One of the reasons that sexual assault is not punished harshly is because people are like, oh, they lose years of their life. In our world, at least, convictions are doled out for such offenses simply because it's not an excuse that is tenable anymore. Lastly, but even if sexual assault gets life sentences, it is going to get in our world as well. Then they argue that we can somehow reform prison system and have greater oversight and better rehabilitation program. First of all, they never explain what this oversight basically is and who are they going to apply this oversight to. So I'm assuming it is going to be applied to the prisoners themselves. Number two, they never explain how exactly are they going to arrange the funds and how exactly are they going to basically materialize this rehabilitation program. I'll explain the comparative later on when I engage with few of their arguments coming out in the DLO speech, but let's engage on this particular argument on a surface level. What they don't understand is that there are more stakeholders involved in their world to implement these reforms on. For their reforms to be possible, they will not only have to convince prison industrial complex and the giant lobby that that particular industrial complex is, but also police administration system and the prison gangs which already operate in the status quo. They haven't engaged with how they engage with the lobbying which is done in the status quo to disproportionately imprison the minorities right now. So I'm not sure how exactly these reforms are going to take place. And then I'll take you in the 5th minute. Even if we assume reforms happen, who is at the receiving end of it is something which is still not answered. They argue that they can have an oversight without providing any mechanism whatsoever, which, even if it is likely, means it will be equally applied on these prisoners as well to enforce these stricter reforms and stricter oversight and stricter surveillance. That means police administration within these prison systems will be more torturous and harsh on them, thus ruining the purpose of establishing this prison system at the first place, which was to reform them. But all we give them is basically more trauma and more hatred towards the system and more hatred towards the society, which basically leads them to commit the crime even if they go out of the prison 10 years, actual 10 years after they have been they have completed their sentences. They argue that the deterrence which exists in the prison system can only exist when we have fear of losing time, and that is the only primary purpose of the system. I'll talk about retribution later as of now. But they hardly justify why time cannot be relative in nature, because the deterrence of losing years in a few days is equally jarring in nature, as you would still be perceiving yourself to have been isolated from the society for years in your mind. And I think that particular deterrence is not just going to be a fear of physicality of it, but rather how exactly it affects your mind as well. So I'm not sure how exactly physicality as a nature becomes an exclusive benefit which they can claim it, because reform happens in the mind and not in your hands or something like that. This system becomes better because at least we are able to give them a second chance to improve their lives after they have a paradigm shift for perceived years you spend in this new simulation. This is where we definitely win over them in cases where there are unnecessarily disproportionate punishment given to the people for petty crimes, like, for example, smoking a doobie. And are condemned to rot in their world because system does not support them once they are out. Then they claim that the actual time spent is better because of the broken glass theory. But this assumes that the surroundings will change and the prisoners will be absolutely reformed in their world, which they never comparatively prove, as they never engage with us or how fucked up the current prison systems are. But sure, you may not join gangs in the world because the time has passed, but they might have vanished, but you will still definitely join the prison gangs which operate outside the prisons, because state literally cannot provide you post-imprisonment rehabilitation, as it takes billions of dollars in tax break money to maintain these so-called reform prison, irrespective of the fact that they are government run or they're private run. If they're private run, it's even more fucked up. But before I engage further, I'll take the POI.
Weigh this debate on a comparative rather than trying to confuse the judges more. Tell us why you're okay with victims losing years of their lives because they have to live in the trauma of the perpetrator of their crimes.
Okay, on that, I think I'll come on that in a minute. Then they argue that they will commit crime against because they can go back to the same setting. But then state has more money in our world to help them out at this particular point, because it can afford to diversify how it spends the money in criminal justice system. Therefore, enabling rehabilitation and moreover reformation even after the prison sentence has been over. They argue that people will stop reporting and data and policy will be affected. But they undermine the deterrence this perceived loss of time has, something which Shakya mentioned in his speech. More prisoners, once they start getting out of this particular system, because these sentences are short, means more data, and therefore more narration of incidences of how exactly this perceived loss of time has been and how deterrent and how dangerous it can be for prisoners as well. And if that is the case, I think the narrative that this particular thing is equally deterrent will exist in our world as well. Then they come up and argue about victims and how exactly they will be affected. But I think we create lesser victims in future when we are able to have an optimal situation wherein they can reform. We can reform these particular prisoners, because in their world, they still haven't explained how exactly they control recidivism, because ultimately, even if they go back in the society after 10 years, sure, victims may feel safe, but these people who might have just smoked a doobie will be harder criminals at this particular point because of the way in which prison systems operate. Overall, this particular debate also on white collar crime and rich people. This is a very specific example which cannot be considered at the first place. But I think Pratik has already mentioned that there are other measures like banning them from committing any sort of commercial activities, etc., which Harsha Mehta was basically banned. So I'm not sure how exactly white collar crime becomes increasingly more in our world in comparison to theirs, because it's not just about sentencing. It's also about fines, banning them, etc. For all these reasons, propose.
All right, I would like to thank the government whip for their fine speech. Now calling upon the opposition whip to end their constructors from their side. Here.
Right. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Right, give me like 10 seconds. POI is on chat. I'll take one after. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the entirety of government whip speech can be taken out by simply going back to their prime minister's speech. Please go back to your sheets and note what Pratik said in the first minute of his speech. He said that there is enough fiat in the world that we are debating in to receive a symmetric amount of support in order to bring about enormous amount of reform in the entire criminal justice system. So which means that there is political will, there is a lesser amount of engagement from extraneous circumstances, which could mean prison lobbies, etc., all the other factors that the government whip talked about, to essentially argue against the fact that we cannot bring about any form of reform in our world. All of those things will not stand at any given point of time because of their prime minister's own admission that there is going to exist enough amount of political will, fiat, in order to bring about any form of change that they want. I don't understand at any point of time why that's not going to apply in our case as well. So therefore, the propensity of change and reform be it the kind of reform that we are arguing for in two different worlds, is going to be something that's going to be exogenous to this debate. At no point of time can you question that by their own admission that we received from the very first minute of the Prime Minister's speech and their own fucking setup, right? But second, in terms of what their deputy, Prime Minister concentrated on, this is an extraneous rebuttal so that you can throw this out of your sheets right from the get-go, right? In terms of private prisons and the entire profiteering argument that they ran, right? Understand the actors who are bad in the current criminal justice system, their incentives and desires and biases in order to game the system and get personal profits and benefits out of it does not change it either world, because they have given you no sort of mechanization as to why these bad actors are simply going to change the way they function in their world. So this primarily means that instead of running industrial complexes where they're hosting prisons for years, they're going to run VR setup shops. They're going to run and gain these patent companies and trademarks in terms of producing the software and gain the same amount of profit that they're doing. And in order to ameliorate the software in a way that prisoners and essentially the people who are convicted stay longer within the system, would incorporate certain aspects to the software or this entire system, like wishy-washy system that they're talking about in terms of VR headsets and simulations, to attain the same goals that they have had in status quo, right? None of that changes. I don't understand how these bad actors that they have kept harping upon that are gaming the current criminal justice system are going to simply change the way they function. I clearly believe that it's easier to game and fuck with simulation systems that are set up in these VR setup shops in order to gain private profit out of it, and it's to deal with huge industrial complexes that require a lot of regulation. So even on margins, right, and likability and propensity for this to happen, actually we take this debate in terms of how it's easier to game simulations like patent companies, software companies, in order to create these arenas and biases that lead to the accumulation of private profit out of these systems in the first place. We don't understand how that's going to be a legitimate consideration in this debate. Thirdly, in terms of the government wanting to eat the cake and have it too, right? They come here in their first part of the speech, they give you this entire rhetoric in terms of a straw man as to how minorities are going to be the majority stakeholder and the maximum amount of convictions that are happening is going to be something that they don't deserve at all. Something that Shruti took apart in her speech by explaining to you and making to you, and even Saida addressed this in her speech, and by addressing the point that how criminals and the convictions that are meted out within the CJS are contingent upon the extraneous circumstances that are existing within that CGS system in and of itself. So therefore, these convictions are not going to change in either world. But on the other hand, they want to give the years back that these minorities and people that they care so fucking about have lost. But on the other hand, in their government speech, they come here and argue that, you know what, in these simulations, they're going to feel the pain. They're going to go through years and they're going to be incapacitated, because that is my response. That is government's response to the entire point of, oh, you know what, I can go back to the same, circumstances that I was born in. I'm not incapacitated physically, emotionally, or mentally, and I can go back to the same core competencies that I used to commit the crimes in the first place. This was their response, right? I don't understand why both things can exist in the same plane. They cannot say that, oh, you know what, this simulation is so fucking real that you're going to lose years of your life and that's going to incapacitate you from committing recidivism in the first place. But, oh, you know what, minorities are going to get their years back. I don't understand what benefit are you trying to accrue to the minorities if this is the point you're trying to run in the first place, right? But in terms of what our positive case was and why we see absolutely no responses to that, right? Number one, government's biggest mistake that is going to lose them this debate is they don't weigh out to you why reformation in the first place, and all the mech they give to you about false convictions, about minorities, etc., that is going to weigh out the retributive system and the retributive considerations that are there within the CGS and why that's important in terms of victim compensation, in terms of total sense of safety within society, in terms of addressing other stakeholders within the CGS and within their entire social ecosystem that we are residing in. In absence of this weighing, you have to understand which side of the house and which side of the bench gave you better analysis as to which consideration is going to be more important in terms of total impact on society. From our very first speech, instead of relying on empty rhetoric and straw man arguments of telling you, oh, you know what, this CGS system is entirely fucked and people get convicted, so therefore let's go for a system that lets them out early, right? Irrespective if we let out heinous criminals and big shots as well, something that I'll come to in a second. We don't understand how our analysis of what retributive justice means, what victim compensation, what idea of justice within society in terms of people that have suffered from the circumstances of a particular crime, seeing those criminals walk around them, is at all going to feature in this debate in terms of government's weighing. We don't understand why that's not going to beat out government's consideration of reform. On big criminals and criminals who are dangerous to society, at all points of time, the government's only response to our idea of big criminals and criminals who essentially can do a lot of harm to society. Their only response was, oh, you know what, other forms of punishment can exist, therefore Harshad Mehta was banned, and therefore all of mechanization and argumentation we receive at off bench goes out of the window. Except we give you analysis as to why criminals and white collar criminals and people who are in power who go to these sentences for years having committed crimes which harm other people, be it sexual assault, be it them having slapped or drove over their secretaries, be it negligence, be it like the Bhopal gas tragedy, all of these offenses, all of these things which require a certain level of privilege to commit in the first place, these shorter sentences where they come out in a few days can still lead to a repetition of these offenses in the first place. I don't understand why Harshad Mehta, someone who's gamed the entire financial system, cannot simply do it again just because he's been banned by the SEBI. People who have been banned, blacklisted, and thrown out of the country still commit financial crimes within our country at the end of the time. Right? So at any point of time, they can commit the same crimes that they have committed so far. But also, secondly, these big criminals and who are fucking dangerous to society can rebuild their image over a period of time, right? The fact that they come out within a few days gives them so much opportunity to fucking game the society and convince them that they're a better person without changing their incentives in the first place. There is no amount of loss that accrues to these stakeholders in the first place. And these instances have been completely ignored by the government by simply weighing to you why minorities and false cases are going to be the entirety of Gov's case and considerations when weighing this debate. We tell you victims are important. We tell you retributive justice is important. We tell you that there are criminals who are heinous and dangerous to society and can lead to guaranteed cases of recidivism because they don't prove to you why the simulation is going to rewire the incentives and biases you have in your brain and is going to lead to magical solutions. For all those reasons, we don't believe government gives us enough incentives to implement this sham system.
All right. I thank the opposition whip for the fine speech. Now, before we go on to the reply speeches, I would like to ask both the sides, would you like a common minute?
Does the tournament policy allow for a common minute? If it does, we don't mind.
All right.
We don't necessarily have a tournament policy for a common minute. I think we can start directly.
All right. Okay, I'll start with that then. Calling upon the opposition reply speaker to end the case from their side. Here.
Hi, I'll be giving the reply. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
All right. Assuming I'm still audible and visible, starting speech in 3, 2, and 1. The weirdest model challenge comes out at GovWhip, which I think is just bad faith debating, but hey, I'll engage. 1, how does OB bring about change? Had you listened to my speech, you would know, and Nitin's speech actually. We said we'd have CCTV cameras, involve more activists and protesters in this oversight and ensuring accountability. Protests and progressive change that happens across the world is something that we would weaponize in actually pushing for legislative change. We talk about how there are going to be rigorous rehabilitation programs and aid for reintegration. Second model challenge is how exactly does OB get buy-in for it? Prateek spends his first minute of his speech talking about how we shouldn't challenge buy-in because that's how fiat works. Same pinch back to you. Finally, then on global prison reform and why that's likely on our side of the house and why the exclusive method of solving these problems is actually not this whack-ass simulation, right? Note that across the world, several countries have already abolished capital punishment and more are moving towards it. Even in a country as regressive as India, you have the rarest of rare doctrine to go ahead and actually hand out capital punishments. Thirdly, we think there is an active push for shorter sentences that is happening globally right now by individuals that are protesting for prison reforms, and that is why we think we are likely to succeed. Shakya in their speech asks us, why has it not happened yet? It is happening though. Are things bad in the status quo? Yes. However, are things significantly better than they were 30 years ago? Also, yes. And that's exactly the kind of change that we on opposition want to go ahead and capitalize on. 4 things then. 1, they say that there is going to be a loss of time. We say we're okay with that, and that's possibly even a good thing. 2, they say prisons are bad. We say we will work to change that in the model that I just had to re-clarify in my reply speech. Thirdly, they say prisoners are victims. We mechanize in Nitin's speech that these are people who think they're better than others. Look, we understand that a lot of crime is a result of state failure. 70% of India's population lives in poverty. 70% of India's population is not going around committing theft. I can promise you that. The individuals that do in fact go ahead and commit theft are people who think they're above the law and think that they can go ahead and get away with it, right? Necessarily go ahead and compare. And also note that like for stealing food, the prison sentence you get is like a slap on your wrist, maybe 2 months in prison. I'm not sure as to why that's something that's so detrimental to these individuals and why they could never recover from that, right? But also more importantly, weigh this against the actual victims in this scenario, right? Like maybe some prisoners are victims, but victims are in all cases definitely real victims. These are individuals who will have to go ahead and see their culprits, their perpetrators who absolutely ruined and changed their lives forever in and around them, right? They will realize that these were individuals who only went to jail for about 1 day. And that's it. That's all the repentance they've done. Rest, everything is inside their heads. And we have to assume that these are individuals that have then necessarily gone ahead and changed. The kind of mental health toll that this takes upon such victims is what they had to weigh this benefit against. And they never actually go ahead and do that. Finally, they tell you that things such as false incarceration happen, and that's a bad thing. We absolutely agree those things are terrible, which is why we're going to use the capital that you are using to abolish all prisons and introduce like fucking video games instead to go ahead and actually push for changes in that. But we also tell you that this isn't the most common form of incarceration, as tragic as it may be. United States of America should really not be the benchmark in any debate because of how it's a shithole of a country, right? So we don't think that that's the norm in all countries across the world. You can't base this in the most ridiculously racist country in the world. But also more importantly, false imprisonments, yes, while they can happen, they can also go ahead and change by virtue of legislative change that happens within the judicial system. But more importantly, the comparative here is the rich individuals that are able to commit crimes and often get away with them. They get to spend like a day in jail and then come out and their lives are again back to normal. Not only can they go back to committing white-collar crimes, this has the double jeopardy problem of 1, rich people having significantly greater capital to be able to commit significantly worse crimes, therefore impacting much larger number of people in society, perhaps most the disenfranchised and minorities that they want to protect on their side of the house, but you're also giving them time, which gives them the ability to go ahead and employ their PR mechanisms and infinite resources in rebuilding their images. Everybody forgets about the crimes of rich people, which is why Louis C.K. picked up that Grammy, incredibly proud to win.
All right, I thank the opposition reply speaker for their fine speech. Now I call upon the government reply speaker to end the case from their side. Here.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, let's go. It's very easy to come in op block, give a bunch of responses, build a new case and say, yeah, we won. Second thing, the opposition accuses us of like saying not catering to fringe actors and then saying, oh, this is why they lose without ever going to the heart of the debate, right? I think we'll take this down considerably throughout my speech. First thing on political win and buy-in, right? What I said in a very nuanced way, which they have misconstrued and strawman beyond belief, is that this trends a middle line between liberals and people who are pro-incarceration, because prisoners necessarily suffer the consequences of feeling the simulation of imprisonment, while also liberals get their sort of like prisoner re-entry and prisoners' rights are taken care of in a better manner, right? Op whip and op reply, they try to misconstrue it and say, oh, but he said political will, and that's why like we win, right? Just because they didn't bring it up in their constructive speeches and prove why necessarily all of the changes happen on their side doesn't mean they can like misconstrue what I said in my speech and then use it in their analysis. Sure, they said how this happens in terms of saying like we'll put up cameras, etc., but they never showed to you why all the political will for the sort of liberal reforms that they necessarily talks about exists. Because I not only tell you how this trends a middle line, but also go ahead and they never engage with the analysis that Shakya gives to you as to why there is an active disincentive to do this in the form of the prison industrial complex, because they gain a lot of money out of it. There's a lot of moneyed interest involved, and that's precisely why none of the crazy hyper liberal reforms like, oh, we'll abolish prisons as a whole will happen in their world. They needed to prove how any of this happens. They can't just be like, oh, we'll put more cameras and thus it won't happen. Like political will, we win there as well. Second thing, right, on victims, right, I am unsure as to how things improve on their side, which Shakya validly raises as well when he talks about paroles, trials, etc. The victim sees them, but also note crucially, right, this is a very shady tactic of saying, oh, serious victims of serious crimes will still feel bad because they never felt the justice that they truly deserve. But the problem is, this is the policy in which they are not affected, because people who like commit serious crimes either receive a life sentence or receive capital punishment. They've tried to deadlock this throughout because they recognize that there is no response to this, right? But moreover, they can't just jingoistically like dismiss it and be like, oh, but like what la la land you live in. I don't think that's a response. They need to systematically deal with this. But anyway, like prove how that improves on their side anyway. But moreover, even if you take them at their best, victims on our side still retribution served to an extent, because time is relative. People who are incarcerated within this virtual prison still feel like the 20 years have passed in their mind, which is likely to be equally jarring a mental experience. And Devashish puts it to you beautifully when he says reform happens in the mind anyway. But even if you add to this the fact that serious criminals necessarily are not the ones who are involved within this particular, the extremely serious criminals are not the ones affected by this policy, we still take it there as well. But even then, even if we take them at their like sort of like they try to strawman the case completely and they say like, oh, but what about gender offenses and stuff like that, they're likely to receive more punishment, because the argument used in courts about, oh, but they lose years of their life is something that is no longer valid, because they're being put to the test and being thrown into jail faster, right? Necessarily then we take it on that metric as well, because we flip that argument completely. Moreover, in terms of how there is no prison reform and how it doesn't happen, no response to this kind of perverse incentives that exist in order to not reform prison, but also the kind of like liberal prison reforms they want are unlikely to happen because of the middling argument that I told you, but also in terms of responding to our benefits, right? In terms of how gang culture is removed, in terms of how there's no longer any police brutality within prisons, in terms of how it's easier for prisoners to reintegrate, and how false imprisonment is and the impact on prisoners is significantly less. There is no way up. They keep saying way up this, way up that, but they never respond to these arguments in substantive speeches and only come in op-block and then they say like, oh, they never did this, never did that. No response to this at all. And that's precisely why we win on the number of benefits they provide, as opposed to the limited number of responses that they have in their two constructive speeches, as well as no engagement apart from an op-block. I think on those benefits itself, we win in terms of how we prove this, but we also drastically improve the prison system as a whole, improve reformation, and also improve the lives of prisoners in general. For those reasons, propose.
All right, I thank the government reply speaker for ending the debate, and with this we come to an end of the open grand finals of the SRDF.
Recording stopped.
So with that, like I wanted to ask Mehul, so how are we going to are we going to be here for the verdict, or do we have to go to a deliberation room and discuss?
So there are 3 breakout rooms that are open. You can join room 1 for all judges can join room 1 open semifinals. Teams can drop out. We'll let you know once everything's ready, and then you can join for like the closing.
Thank you for the debate, everyone. Thank you for judging.
Also, judges, if you could give us the open finals best speaker or DM it to either me or Astha, and that should be good. Or anyone from the tapping wants. Thank you so much.
All right, we'll do
Thank you, guys.